All right, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome the last speaker of what has been a great afternoon of talks, Dr. Kim Lindblade. So Dr. Lindblade holds a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology and Immunology from the University of Arizona. She then followed it up with an MPH here at Michigan and then transitioned to her PhD work under Mark Wilson, where she looked at the effect of weather variability and land use changes on highland malaria in southwest Uganda. Now, Dr. Lindblade also has a wealth of international experience as a field epidemiologist with the CDC and partner organizations. I'll list a few examples that in no way do justice to all her work. She has worked as a field epidemiologist with the CDC in Western Kenya. She was also part of the Haiti earthquake response team in 2010. She has been involved in surveillance outbreak investigations in Mexico and Guatemala, and was also part of the Ebola response part of the response team to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Prior to her current appointment, Dr. Lindblade worked as a director of the influenza program of the Thai Ministry of Health, which was a joint program with the CDC and the Thai government. And she's currently the team lead of the elimination unit of the global malaria program of the WHO in Geneva. Dr. Lindblade has more than 110 publications to her name in topics such as diverse malaria, Ebola, land use change, disease surveillance, onchocerciasis, which I admit I had to look up, diarrheal disease, and emerging infections. She also sits on the editorial boards of a number of high-impact publications, such as the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, the Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases, and the Journal of the American Medical Association. She's also received a number of awards, including the CDC's National Center for Environmental Health for Excellence in Global Efforts, the Consortium of Universities Global Health Directors Award for Service in Global Public Health, and has been nominated twice for the Charles C. Shepard Award, and has been nominated twice for the Charles C. Shepard Science Award. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lindblade to give us a talk on how low-density malaria infections and what challenges they pose to malaria control and elimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that introduction, but thank you most of all for not mentioning how long ago I got my MPH degree. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak here today. It's thanks both to Betsy and to the MAC-EPID symposium for inviting me, and of course to Mark for suggesting me for this. It's quite an honor both to come back to speak in the hall where I first learned about logistic regression, but also it's a particular honor to be here for Mark's retirement because he was instrumental in getting me to where I am now, and at least in part for my career, which has really brought a lot of joy to my life. So I thank you for that. I first met Mark in 1996 when I had a very definite project I wanted to do, which I never recommend to any graduate students. Always follow the money. I didn't have any money. I just knew what I wanted to do, and I was very stubborn about it. And I didn't have anyone who had the expertise to look across ecology and epidemiology in malaria. And then I ran into Mark and Maria Monde when they were here in 1996, checking out the faculty position at Michigan. And he told me about his background, and I was just amazed that I had found him here and that I was going to be able to work with him. And the rest is history for me anyways. And I didn't have any slides of Mark because we really worked together in the pre-digital era. And most of my slides are now in a storage facility somewhere outside of Atlanta. But I did find a copy of one of my dissertation papers, and I think any student of Mark's is going to recognize this immediately, both for an incredible use of a very expert use of copy editing symbols, which I probably had to study up on at the time, but also his lack of appreciation for dangling modifiers and other kinds of creative grammar. But as a result of this, I definitely became a much better writer. So I wanted to start the talk today with just maybe sort of like a hanger for my talk, which is this sort of process of setting policy and implementing program and policy that was presented by a professor from the University of Hamburg last week. And I thought it was interesting to me because as an epidemiologist, especially as a field epidemiologist, I've spent a lot of time on this first phase, which is helping to perceive a problem and setting an agenda. And that's involved in doing things like, in doing surveillance and doing descriptive epidemiology and identifying risk factors. So we know sort of who is most at risk of disease, where, place and time, et cetera, and using that as a way to set the agenda for what public health problems need to be addressed. And also as a field epidemiologist, I spent a lot of time on the second part, which is on implementing and evaluating interventions. So doing randomized trials, conducting observational studies, and doing monitoring and evaluation. But this phase 2 on the policy formulation and decision making, I really always saw it as a bit of a black box, because I didn't see how that was happening. I was churning out papers and reports, and it was somewhere going somewhere, and somebody looked at it, and maybe it had some kind of an influence on a policy decision at some point, but I never really understood how that happened. And now I'm at WHO, and so I spent a couple of years now getting to know, at least on the malaria front, how these surveillance data and epi data may or may not be used to create policies. And so this is a nice sort of 30,000-foot view of the policymaking process. It looks all very clean and straightforward, but I can tell you now after 2 years, it's really much more like this. A lot of like turning back around on ourselves, rethinking the problem, taking some false turns, and maybe eventually getting to that point. And so today I'm going to tell you a particular story of a perception of a problem, how it may have been misperceived, what the consequences have been, and how we're still somewhere in that loop trying to make our way to understanding what the policy implications are. And because I'm telling you a story, I have to put this disclaimer up so that you know that the viewpoints are mine alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the World Health Organization. So let's talk first about the perception of the problem. And it was great to have Justin go before me because he was able to give you the history of malaria, which of course is a fascinating history. Can you still hear me okay? Yeah. And so this map shows what's really been happening over the last 120 or so years, this shrinking of the malaria extent of transmission. So in the 1900s, you can see that we had the risk of malaria even up to where we're sitting today, at least during the summer months, as well as up into the northern reaches of Europe and Sweden, and as far south as the northern territories in Australia. And now in 2016, there's a huge difference. Europe is malaria-free. It's been malaria-free now since 2015. Australia was certified malaria-free as well. And the center part of Africa, which was the most endemic, holo-endemic area in the world, is actually a much lighter green now. So we've made some really substantial progress. And that progress has come largely as a result of some key interventions, which Justin mentioned. The first are the insecticide-treated bed nets, which were first evaluated in the late 80s and then really scaled up in the early 2000s as a result of the start of the Global Fund and then the President's Malaria Initiative. Indoor residual spraying, which is the application of a residual insecticide inside a house to kill mosquitoes that land after taking a blood meal. And again, because of the President's Malaria Initiative, there's been a real increase, even though the percentage is still small, there's been a large increase in households covered by indoor residual spraying. And then the artemisinin and combination therapies, which have helped delay the onset of drug resistance by pairing a very short-acting, rapid-clearing drug, an artemisinin derivative, with a longer-acting drug that mops up those remaining parasites. And so we've seen this reduction in both the incidence of morbidity and mortality over time, a 37% decrease from 2000 to 2015 in morbidity and a 60% decrease in mortality. And when I was starting out, it got a little boring to write all of our papers saying that there were between 3 and 500 million malaria cases every year and 1 to 2 million deaths. And now we say there's approximately 200 million malaria cases a year and about 780,000 deaths. So it's really changed in a very short period of time. And a lot of that progress has come as a result of those interventions. And this is an analysis that was done by a group that included Justin, where they looked at the decline in parasite prevalence on the y-axis. It's the Plasmodium falciparum parasite prevalence in children, which has gone from around 33% to somewhere around 17%. They modeled the counterfactual, what would have probably happened even without malaria interventions just due to increasing development, and estimated that somewhere around 660 million clinical cases have been averted in the last 15 or so years. And most of that was due to this vector control measures, which make up about 80% of that reduction. So pretty remarkable stuff. In 2016, WHO launched the Global Malaria Technical Strategy to extend through 2030. And because of these improvements in malaria over the last few years, one of the central pillars is this idea of accelerating efforts towards elimination and attainment of malaria-free status, and ultimately achieving the vision of a world free of malaria. So even though the Global Malaria Eradication Program officially ended in 1969, WHO never abandoned the ultimate goal of eradication, and that's still reflected in this global technical strategy. Now, we've been set with some pretty ambitious goals. So by 2020, a 40% reduction in mortality, a 40% reduction in malaria case incidence, and elimination from at least 10 countries that had malaria transmission in 2015. And ultimately, by 2030, hoping to reduce down to 90% of the transmission that was there in 2015. And this is, again, along the pathway taking us to eventual global eradication of malaria. And we do have some bright spots in the eliminations area. This graph shows the number of countries that have reached certain thresholds in terms of caseloads. And you can see that between 2010 and 2017, the number of countries that have reached fewer than 10,000 confirmed indigenous malaria cases has gone from 37 to 46. And even more remarkable, the countries that are really just on the cusp of eliminating has doubled in that period from 11 to 22 countries. So in the elimination space, we seem to see some good progress, but there's always more to be done. And what we really want to do is try and accelerate the time it takes for countries to eliminate. Justin showed you Panama, that's sort of been dabbling along at a more or less the same number of cases for at least the last 10 years. And looking at the countries that have eliminated between 2000 and 2017, there were 17 countries that reached zero. And then looking back, this graph shows how many years it took before they were, what cases, the number of cases they had given a certain number of years before they reached elimination. And we want to be able to bend this curve. We don't want it to take this long. We don't want countries that are at around 10,000 cases to take basically 15 years before they get to zero. We'd like to see a curve more like this. So we need to improve on elimination. We need to get to elimination faster. We need to find new strategies to try and get faster because the money is not increasing, and we may be running out of some interventions over time. But then there's this other phenomenon where we see some places that have just stagnated. I worked in Western Kenya on the shores of Lake Victoria for about 5 years, and in the 1980s, the parasite prevalence in kids was around 80%. Probably if you did PCR, it was 100% infection rate in that time period. And then this was one of the first sites to participate in the community randomized trials of insecticide-treated bed nets. So they got bed nets early. They started to see reductions in parasite prevalence. And by 2006, it had reduced to half of what it had been just about 20 years before. So that was a really significant improvement. But since that time, we've just seen parasite prevalence kind of fluctuating between about 25 and 45% every year, and no real significant improvements in that over time. So that's left a lot of people scratching their heads saying, what's going on? Why aren't we continuing to see improvement when we have insecticide-treated bed nets, we have ACTs, we have IRS, we have good case management? Why aren't we continuing to see improvement? And in fact, it's now being seen across the globe. So this is the World Malaria Report from last year. And despite the improvements that we were seeing up until about 2015, we are now seeing pretty much a plateau. And so this is the mortality rate for malaria in Africa, and this is it for the world, and we don't see improvements over the last few years. And so we are now communicating around the idea that we're at a crossroads. We have to do something to get back on track to try and get the world to continue to see reductions and to not flatline at this point without more progress. So as we've been scratching our heads and trying to figure out what more can we do, there's certainly this aspect that was brought up about residual transmission. So even though we have this fairly effective intervention, insecticide-treated bed nets and indoor residual spraying that protects people when they're inside and sleeping under, at least under the net part, we know that there's significant exposure before they go to bed, because people are still either outside enjoying themselves or inside and exposed to indoor biting mosquitoes. There's also additional exposure when they rise very early in the morning. And then there's, in many countries, there's an entire group of people who are exposed because of occupations that take them working outside, who are exposed to outdoor biting mosquitoes, for whom we really have very little to offer. And in addition, we know that bed nets are a leaky intervention. If you don't deploy them properly, if they have holes, if you get out of them in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, then you can get exposed to mosquito bites there. And so this is not a perfect intervention. And so there's a lot of effort to try and address outdoor biting of mosquitoes and to try and improve protection from indoor biting and indoor resting mosquitoes. So that's one area. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's certainly an area that's being explored for potential improvements in vector control. But then the other area that people have focused on a lot is the idea that they're of the asymptomatic parasite reservoir. I also participated in sort of highlighting this potential problem. And this is not just a problem considered for high burden areas, but it's also been referred to as a potential threat to elimination. So potentially countries that are trying to eliminate may feel that they have this problem of parasites that are in people who are not experiencing symptoms and therefore not seeking treatment. So I want to go into a little bit more how the perception of the problem has been developed and what's come about as a result of it. So the obligatory life cycle of malaria. So I think most of you know that it starts with a mosquito taking a blood meal from an infected individual. They ingest the sexual stage of the malaria parasite, which goes on to reproduce within the mosquito, and then sporozoites are released into the salivary glands, and when the mosquito takes a second bite after the incubation period, then it injects these sporozoites into the human, into a susceptible human, who then goes through a liver cycle, after which the parasite migrates into the peripheral blood. It develops in the blood, and then it ruptures, releasing toxic products into the bloodstream and causing cytokine release and development of fever and tissue damage. So just to remember, as we go through, this sexual stage is particularly important because that is the stage that is transmitted to mosquitoes and goes on to develop an infection, as well as the rupturing of the schizont, which is what ends up inducing immunity, as well as causing the symptoms that are associated with malaria. In terms of transmission, this is a picture of an Anopheline mosquito that's taken a blood meal, so you can see its bright red abdomen. Mosquitoes usually take blood meals that are approximately 2 to 3 microliters in size. We know that gametocytes actually need a couple of days to mature after they've been released into the bloodstream, so gametocytes that are ingested early won't necessarily go on to produce infections, but if they're mature, then they will inside the mosquito. And we also know that it's just a minimum of 2 gametocytes that are needed in order to transmit malaria, 1 male and 1 female. But there's a lot of complexity to this transmission because, first of all, female gametocytes outnumber the males, but we also know that gametocytes aggregate, and so that can actually end up facilitating transmission because they're able to find gametocytes in the blood and ensure that they have the right ratio of male to female. So we also know this slide is showing the percent of mosquitoes that become infected based on the density of gametocytes in the blood. This was blood taken from infected Kenyan children. They were not exposed to mosquitoes directly, but the blood was put into a membrane feeder and then fed, and then dissected. The mosquitoes were dissected after the extrinsic incubation period or some interval in it in order to determine how many of them had become infected. And so you can see that this is a log scale here, and so there's an exponential rise in the proportion of mosquitoes that are infective based on the density of gametocytes in the blood. These open circles are individuals that were not parasitemic according to microscopy at the time that they had their blood taken, and the dark circles are those that were parasitemic, patently parasitemic at the time that they had their blood taken. And this graph shows that really at this very low level, somewhere around 5 parasites per microliter, infection is very unlikely in mosquitoes. So the density of parasites in the blood becomes too low to achieve a successful infection. And among these 100 Kenyan children, approximately half of them were positive by slide microscopy so that you could see parasites on the slide. That means that it was above a certain density threshold. Then 25% of them were negative by microscopy, but found to be positive using polymerase chain reaction, which is a much more sensitive diagnostic. But then 25 of them were actually negative by both methods. And interestingly, even those that were negative by PCR were still able to infect some mosquitoes. So if we look at those 3 groups, those that were patently parasitemic infected about 8% of mosquitoes. Those that had lower density infections but still detectable by PCR, about 4%. and those that were negative on both still managed to infect about almost 2% of the mosquitoes. And when you combine this infection rate with the size of the population, the proportion of the infectious reservoir is made up like this, where actually those groups, the group that was PCR positive but microscopy negatives makes up a much larger proportion of the infectious reservoir than would have been indicated by their proportion in the general population. So this kind of information gets people very nervous, because if we don't know that they're infected, but they're still transmitting, then what can we possibly do about that?
Can you clarify the x-axis on your graph up there?
This is the log density of gametocytes in the blood as measured through PCR. So what diagnostic methods do we have? I mentioned a couple of them. The first is to know is that WHO recommends only microscopy and rapid diagnostic tests for malaria diagnosis. Our rapid diagnostic tests are lateral flow immunochromatographic assays. Here's a cassette right here. Two different antigens may be used, are most of the tests that are used. One is the histidine-rich protein 2, which is a very sensitive antigen for Plasmodium falciparum, but it has a long tail, so even after someone's infection has been cured, you can still be HRP2 positive. And parasite lactose dehydrogenase, which is less sensitive, but is produced by all Plasmodium parasite species, and is cleared more quickly from the blood. It doesn't have the same long tail that HRP2 does. And these tests were specifically designed to detect antigen equivalent to around 100 to 200 parasites per microliter. And that level becomes quite important. That's sort of the limit of detection for rapid diagnostic tests. And it was done in that way because most of the clinical infections are going to occur above this threshold of this density. And it wasn't considered necessary from a clinical standpoint to be able to detect very low density infections which were unlikely to be causing symptoms. So this graph was used in some of the early reviews of rapid diagnostic tests. So the square in the middle here shows the percentage of parasites that would be below this detection threshold of 200 parasites. And the bottom here is those parasites that are even below 100 parasites per microliter. And these are a series of studies, a mixture of cross-sectional and clinical samples. And you can see that there are a few studies where there's a fairly substantial proportion of infections that are below the detection limit for rapid diagnostic tests, but still many others where there seems like a reasonable limit of detection to be used for diagnosis. And when we compare the different diagnostics limits of detection, we have rapid diagnostic tests, which are roughly between 1 to 200 parasites per microliter. Microscopy, which if you get an expert microscopist can get as low as 50 parasites per microliter, but is kind of overlapping rapid diagnostic tests. And then PCR, which can even get down to extremely low levels. And so this difference between the microscopy level or the level below rapid diagnostic tests and what's detectable by PCR is referred to in multiple ways. Sometimes we say subpatent, sometimes we say submicroscopic, and then the term that's getting more play recently is to call them low density infections. And if we look in a population of people who are infected with parasites, in this case it's Plasmodium vivax, they sort of divide into three groups. We have the clinical cases, shown in this darker color here, and they generally tend to have higher parasite densities. Then we have the asymptomatic infections, but they have lower density infections, but still largely detectable by microscopy. And then we have those infections that are very low. Almost everyone in that category is going to be without symptoms, and that's only detectable by highly sensitive nucleic acid-based tests. In this particular study that was done in Ethiopia, the clinical cases were detected from symptomatic individuals seeking care, but it's important to note that these other two groups were actually detected through cross-sectional sampling. And these lines here show the probability of detection by microscopy. So most of these infections that are clinical could be detected by microscopy, but very few of these low-density infections would ever be picked up by microscopy, given the limits of detection. So again, if we imagine this infectious reservoir is represented by this pie, then we have these three groups. The first are those that are febrile, symptomatic, and they have detectable patent infections. So we can identify them through our passive surveillance system if they come in to seek treatment. Then we have that group in red who are not symptomatic, but their parasite densities are high enough that we can detect them with rapid diagnostic tests or microscopy, and so we might look for them through active surveillance approaches. And then we have this other wedge of the pie where they're not symptomatic and their parasite densities are low enough that we're unable to detect them using conventional diagnostics. And really, what's particularly critical is to know how big that pie slice is and how many onward infections in mosquitoes are they able to generate. So I'm going to show you a series of slides from a paper done by Lucy O'Kell and others. They did a systematic review of studies where individuals had been diagnosed by both microscopy or by PCR. I'm only going to show you the microscopy and PCR data, but similar results have been generated for RDTs and PCR. And this graph shows the prevalence in the community by PCR and then the prevalence by slides. And if they were equal, then they would all be along this diagonal line here. But in fact, they're all below, and it shows then that PCR is able to detect more infections than microscopy is. And in fact, they detect microscopy can detect only about half of the PCR confirmed infections. When they modeled it or stratified by age, they found a better fit to the model. And then they used that they were actually able to generate formulas to predict the PCR prevalence based on just the microscopy prevalence. And then they used that to estimate what the sensitivity of microscopy is in a given area. And they found that submicroscopic infections range from about 70 to 80% in areas with very low parasite prevalence, as measured by PCR, and made up only about 20% in the high transmission areas. So this graph is summarizing that data. So again, the parasite density was actually lowest in the low transmission areas and increased to the high transmission areas. And the percent of infections that were submicroscopic, shown in this blue line here, actually decreased. So this is saying essentially that the low density infections that are largely asymptomatic appear to be more of a problem in these low transmission areas. This graph shows similar data. This is another systematic review that was done that looked at now RDTs and PCR. And I like this graph because, first of all, it shows by the size of these bars how big the parasite reservoir was in these areas. And the width of the bar, each of these different colored bars is a different age group, and the width shows the size of the age group. And the bars above the line show the percentage of infections that were detectable by rapid diagnostic tests, and below the bar shows those that were detectable by PCR only and not by rapid diagnostic tests. And so again, these data indicate that the majority of the infections in the low transmission area were undetectable by rapid diagnostic tests, somewhere between 75 and 95% of infections. But in the high transmission areas, it was much lower, from between 43 and 80%. So then the group by O'Kell et al. Took these paired data of microscopy and PCR across these different studies, these cross-sectional surveys that were done from areas with very low transmission to very high transmission, and they estimated the size of the size of the populations that were detectable by microscopy or by PCR only. So the blue here shows that all of the infections in the low transmission area could only be detected by PCR, whereas in the high transmission areas, the majority of infections were detectable by microscopy and PCR wasn't necessary to find most of those infections. This is a complicated graph in part because she also does it by age, so you can see how the age distribution, and generally older adults are having more infections that can more low density infections, so they have more infections only detectable by PCR. And then they used some other studies that had looked at the infectiousness of these infections to mosquitoes. So 4 studies at that point that had been published that used mostly membrane feeding, fed mosquitoes on infected individuals, some of whom were microscopy positive and some of whom did not have infections detectable by microscopy. And you can see that in general, the proportion of mosquitoes infected was higher among those that had detectable, higher density infections, but still a substantial proportion of those that were not detectable could still infect mosquitoes, except for one study here that didn't show much of a difference between those two groups. So using these data and the size of the asymptomatic low-density reservoir that was determined from those cross-sectional studies, they again looked at what proportion of the infectious reservoir is submicroscopic based on those 3 studies of infectiousness, with the slide prevalence, so the community level of transmission here on the x-axis. And they found that somewhere between, at the lowest levels of transmission, somewhere between 20 and 60% of the population of the parasites were submicroscopic. So the implications from these studies were that the subpatent infections make up a greater proportion of all infections, and that's more important in low transmission than in high transmission settings. And that subpatent infections can infect mosquitoes, but they do so at a lower rate than higher density infections do. And that despite the lower infection rates, the size of that asymptomatic and subpatent population leads them to make up a greater proportion of the infectious reservoir. And so overall then, the big picture from these data are that the contribution of these subpatent infections to transmission is more important in the areas of very low transmission than in the high transmission areas. And I have to say, like, what? That doesn't really make sense to me, given everything we know about immunity. So we get back to the perception of the problem. Have we perceived the problem correctly? And if not, why not? Well, first of all, this is part of the story, is what can we do about these asymptomatic low-density infections to begin with, no matter where they occur? And certainly I think most people would say the best way to attack these infections is through mass drug administration, where you don't have to worry about who's infected. You give everybody a drug, and not only do you cure everyone who's infected at this time, but you have a prophylactic period over which they're protected from getting new infections. And in fact, MDA can be really successful. This is an example of a study, or not a study actually, this was a programmatic implementation of mass drug administration in the Comoros. The Comoros is off the coast of Madagascar. It's really 3 islands. And on this big island, they had a lot of malaria through 2013. In 2013, they had about 55,000 cases of confirmed malaria, all falciparum. They did a mass drug administration and a mass distribution of long-lasting meds, and the next year they got 2,200 cases. So mass drug administration can be very effective. However, this is an island setting, and our examples of MDA from non-island settings where there's a lot of population movement haven't proven to be as successful. And there's a lot of concern about trying to give a lot of drug to a population that may not be very exposed, may not be at great risk. And there's still some concern, although maybe without great basis, for the potential of accelerating drug resistance. So another way to get at these infections are what are called mass screen and treat or mass test and treat strategies, where you use your rapid diagnostic test everyone irrespective of symptoms, and if they're positive, you treat them, and if they're negative, you're not. And there's a lot to be said for these approaches because you can show someone the RDT, and they can see that they're infected, and that may make them more compliant with the drugs. It also gives you great surveillance data. But this study was done in Burkina Faso. They randomized communities to either being screened completely over 3 screening periods or getting sort of a partial screening. And they did see a big impact here. This is each campaign on the x-axis, and the intervention arm is in the gray, and the control arm here. So they did see a big drop in the prevalence of low-density or asymptomatic infections in the intervention arm, but it didn't end up having any impact on the incidence of symptomatic malaria infections. So that was pretty disappointing. And a similar study in Zambia that was a stepped wedge design, but also with communities randomly allocated to the intervention or control arm. They also saw actually a better reduction in the prevalence of malaria infection in the intervention arm. But over time, that effect was not sustained. And then I was involved in a trial in Western Kenya where we did 2 years of mass test and treat, 3 rounds in each year, and measured through passive surveillance the incidence of clinical malaria, shown here in the control arm, which is the dashed line, and the intervention arm in the black line. And although we did get around a 13% reduction in incidence, I can tell you, given the amount of effort involved here, this didn't really knock anyone's socks off. But one of the conclusions from these trials of mass test and treat was not that maybe that approach doesn't really work for a variety of reasons, including the extreme amount of population mixing that's happening, But really, they focused on the diagnostic test and said, well, maybe the real problem is we're missing all those low-density infections, those asymptomatic infections that are not detectable by a rapid diagnostic test. So the World Health Organization had a review group on mass drug administration and came out basically with a recommendation that suggested that our current diagnostic tests weren't sensitive enough. There was also a series of very important reports in the Malaria, which was the Malaria Eradication Research Agenda, that also called for, under the diagnostic section, a more sensitive diagnostic that was going to be useful in reactive or proactive screening and treat strategies for people who had this subclinical infection status. And as a result, we have a new, highly sensitive, rapid diagnostic test. So this test was launched last year on World Malaria Day. It is purported to be able to increase the limit of detection tenfold, so somewhere around 2 parasites per microliter. And on the label claim, it says the systematic identification and treatment of infected individuals will reduce the malaria reservoir in the community and thereby drive down transmission. And it's footnoted here, and I'll challenge anybody to find that footnote. I can't find it anywhere. I have no idea what they're referring to here. Where they got the evidence for this, I don't know. But a new diagnostic test, like you might say, well, sensitive is always better, right? We always want a new, more sensitive diagnostic. What could possibly be wrong with a new test like this? Except I'm talking to a room of epidemiologists, and you all know that more sensitive doesn't always mean better, and certainly more sensitive doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a greater impact. And any time that you've got a new test like this, you have a number of programmatic implications that are going to have cost associated with them. We were talking about these non-malarial fevers. What do you do with a test that now picks up everybody in a given area as being malaria positive, either because they currently have low-density infections or because of that long HRP2 tail? They were treated some while ago, but they're still positive, and so now all of a sudden you think, oh, they're malaria positive, I give them malaria medicine and send them home, and you never even look for whether the child has pneumonia or something else that may be causing their fever. So if you're going to introduce a new diagnostic test, you have to think through these different issues. We know that we don't really need this test for clinical care. We're pretty satisfied with the existing RDTs that we have, that we are saving lives and we're able to identify the infections that need to be treated. This is more expensive, and so that's going to mean that we're going to be able to buy fewer nets or fewer malaria drugs. We have this potential false positivity issue, and all of this requires more staff retraining in order to make sure that they are looking for those other causes of fever and not necessarily just relying on the rapid diagnostic test. And this may increase our use of antimalarials, which may or may not be a good thing. And so really, is this test needed? So now we go back to that perception problem. And do the data that help to lead to the perception that these low-density asymptomatic infections are particularly key really make sense? So I go back to basic understanding of malarial immunity. This is just an indicative graph here. Intensity on the y-axis could refer both to the intensity and severity of symptoms or the intensity of infection. So someone who's uninfected gets bitten by an infectious mosquito, their parasite density is going to rise quickly and they're going to be very, very ill. But as they get subsequent infections, they develop immunity. They are able to develop tolerance to higher parasite densities, and they're less likely to be febrile, to the point that we normally consider people who've been exposed multiple times to be largely tolerant, so not producing fever, and to be able to control their parasite densities. And in fact, you can sort of see that here, that symptomatic individuals have a higher parasite density. Actually, I put that in for another reason. So I want to talk about longitudinal cohort data, because we're looking at a lot of data that was generated from cross-sectional surveys. But if we look at longitudinal data, and this is a nice paper that just came out from Uganda, where 3 cohorts of children in 3 different parts of the country with different levels of transmission were followed for 2 to 3 years, and they captured or attempted to capture all symptomatic illness episodes. They made treatment-free. They had frequent contacts with the families and invited them to come anytime the child was feeling ill, and they would give them health care and free medical treatment. They also scheduled visits every 3 months to see the children and to capture any asymptomatic episodes that might be occurring. They only used slide microscopy in this, and it's important to remember that. But they also did a really nice job of directly measuring transmission, so not using a community-level transmission measure, but actually measuring entomologic inoculation rates in the house. And that's essentially capturing mosquitoes in the house, seeing how many of them had sporozoites from malaria. And so you get what's called the number of infectious bites per person per time period. And so these two graphs show first the effect on body temperature of increasing age in the cohorts in the three areas. So the green is the lowest transmission, the red is the moderate, and the blue is the highest level of transmission. And so they measured body temperature during infections between 50,000 and 200,000. So this is temperature based on a certain level of parasite density. And so the effect of age is pretty clear. So with increasing age, there was a lower body temperature given that fairly high rate of malaria parasite density. And this shows that increasing tolerance occurs with age. And that's independent of exposure from the data that they had as well, because they were measuring these EIRs in the household. But then we look at the impact of these differing transmission intensities, and we can see that also in moderate to high transmission area, body temperature decreased by almost a degree for each doubling of the entomologic inoculation rate. So as transmission increased, their tolerance also increased, and so therefore they were less likely to be febrile. But however, in this low transmission area, it was a little bit funny. They actually were able to tolerate higher parasite densities than in high transmission settings. And this is interesting. We'll come back to this as to whether this is sort of a fluke, because it turned out their low transmission area had fairly recently been a higher transmission area. So this may be reflecting a level of immunity that was more akin to this moderate area. Or it may indicate something about development of immunity in places where you get very infrequent exposures. So this sort of just shows the general relationship that these data are showing, that as exposure increases, the probability of fever given a certain level of parasite density is going to decline. So low transmission, more symptomatic; high transmission, less symptomatic. And the same relationship with age. There's something about the maturation of the immune system that also allows older people to be more tolerant of, less likely to generate fever given a certain level of parasite density. Now, looking at parasite density itself, looking at the effect of age, that we saw that the parasite densities decreased by a factor of almost 0.8 for each additional year of life. This is a combination of symptomatic and asymptomatic parasite infections. And it would be nice if they would separate these out at some point. But then when you look across the entomologic inoculation rate, the densities increased in the moderate to high areas for each increase, so that they had lower parasite densities at higher levels of transmission. But there was, again, this funny pattern in this low transmission area, which may be an artifact or may suggest something interesting. And again, the same relationship. Those in low transmission areas have very high parasite densities, and those that are younger have high parasite densities. And so to put it together, this slide over here shows the probability of becoming symptomatic on infection. And essentially for all age groups except for the youngest children, the probability of becoming symptomatic on infection is much higher in the low transmission settings than it is in the high transmission settings. So in low transmission areas, they're more likely to have higher densities and more likely to be symptomatic when infected. Now, there are some limitations to this Uganda study. They didn't use highly sensitive diagnostics. They just used microscopy. However, they did a series of sensitivity analyses, and a more sensitive diagnostic they didn't think would likely to have an impact on these results. I think importantly, their entomologic inoculation rate was still very high. Their lowest was 2. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that means that everyone receives 2 infectious bites in a year. I know personally I've never had an infectious bite, and if I did, I'd be pretty sick. So even getting 2 is still generating a fair amount of immunity in people over time. So this may not be very representative of extremely low transmission areas. And as I mentioned, their low transmission area was unusual, which could be that it used to have malaria, and so you still have a lot of population level immunity, or it could be this other idea that there's better development of immunity when you have very few infectious bites. But in conclusion, this longitudinal approach to looking at malaria confirms our classic understanding of the development of fever tolerance and anti-parasite immunity with exposure. So now we go back to this graph here, which is sort of driving a lot of the concern about low-density asymptomatic infections. And I have to say, have we made a classic epidemiologic mistake, which is one of the first things we learned here at the School of Epidemiology and the School of Public Health, is that prevalence is equal to incidence times duration. So if you are knocking out all of these infections because they're symptomatic and because they're highly density, then these cases fall out of the prevalence pool, and they may not be there when you go to do your cross-sectional survey. So just to illustrate that, let's say we have a low transmission area and a high transmission area. Low transmission is so low I have to put a lot of people there, but high transmission is about 60 infections. And this is showing the cumulative number of infections that occurred over, say, the previous 30 days. This is completely made up, so don't try and follow the numbers or take them to be anything real. And these red figures show somebody who got infected with malaria. So in the high transmission area, because they've had so much exposure in the past, they're able to control their parasite densities, and actually their parasite densities are generally lower. You may get somebody in the low transmission area who's also able to do that, maybe because there are pockets of higher transmission in the low transmission area, or because this person has moved in from a higher transmission area. And then, again, the people who are in the high transmission area are also more able to control their fever, in part because they have lower parasite densities, but also because of this anti-fever immunity that has developed over exposure. And again, you may get one person in the low transmission area who's able to do that. And then all of those symptomatic people in the low transmission area, they get treated because they're sick. So assuming everyone has access to care, they're treated and they're basically no longer parasitemic. And then you get, what then happens in the high transmission areas potentially happens because it's higher transmission, that you get a number of people who are reinfected very quickly. And that reinfection may be with a different clone, a different strain of parasite, to which they might have some partial cross immunity, but not enough. And so their parasite densities can increase, although they still largely remain afebrile. So then when you go to do your cross-sectional study, the infections remaining in the low transmission area are largely afebrile and have lower densities, because they're the only ones that are left. And in the high transmission areas, while most of them are afebrile, you may still find higher densities because they can tolerate them without causing fevers and because they've had reinfections. And so perhaps this is why all the studies that are based on the cross-sectional data are finding very different, are coming to very different conclusions than we would normally have thought. So I'll just say that I like this approach. This is a modeling approach by Jolene Girardin. And this attempts to show different levels of detectability of infection. So here are RDT positives in the pink and microscopy positives in the yellow. And then these blue are the blue and the gray are those that cannot be detected by point-of-care diagnostics or point-of-contact diagnostics. She does a whole lot of math and then eventually comes up with this box over here, which shows a very low entomologic inoculation rates. Close to 90% are detectable by microscopy or rapid diagnostic tests. And actually, it's more the higher transmission levels where you start to see more of the infections, a larger proportion that are low density and perhaps not detectable with our current diagnostics. And then another factor which has to be taken into consideration is the change in immunity to malaria over time. So we know that areas that haven't seen a lot of transmission, there is a loss of immunity, and then of course that also contributes to the potential for infections to be largely symptomatic. And this was illustrated quite clearly in Cabo Verde, which is an island off the coast of Senegal. They had a malaria outbreak in 2017, and they had a pretty severe outbreak. During that time period, they were going out and testing in what's called reactive case detection. So after a symptomatic case came in, they would go to the houses around that case and test everybody. And the blue here shows all the tests that they did, and the reds are essentially all of the positives that they found. They did something like 2,000 tests during that time period, and they only came up with 7 true positives. 6 of the 7 were already symptomatic by the time they found them, and they were probably going to go to the health center the following day, and the 7th one became symptomatic the very day that they found it. So really,
What was the test?
a rapid diagnostic, a conventional RDT that they were doing.
So the least sensitive.
The least sensitive, yeah. And Sri Lanka achieved malaria elimination in 2016, and this series of studies was done in 2009, so about 7 years before they were certified. And essentially they went out and took a big sample of people, I think around 1,900 people in one area and 1,500 people in another area. The most the areas that had seen the most malaria in the past, and they tested them all by PCR, and they found no positives. So they had no sort of reservoir of infection that was out there waiting to sort of reignite. So now what next? Well, WHO conducted a technical consultation on the use of these highly sensitive point of contact tests, and some few conclusions that, first of all, we need to do diagnostic accuracy tests, which hasn't really been done for the new RDT yet. Currently, we recommend that these new RDTs and any that are to come would only be used for research until we can determine a public health impact of deploying them. We've identified some potential use cases, including mass test and treat, reactive case detection, malaria, and pregnancy, but everyone's very clear we do not need these tests for clinical care. So will we see large-scale community randomized trials using these highly diagnostic tests? I'm not a donor. I don't know if anyone's going to fund these tests. You would imagine that MDA is always going to be better, and we still see limited impact of MDA in places that are very well connected when there's a lot of population movement. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot of call to do mass test and treat trials, but it's possible. And ultimately, the only way we're really going to understand whether these tests have an impact is not through all of these modeling and trying to put things together, but it's probably seeing it work on the ground. Because not only is it the issue of the actual importance of the infections, but it's also all the other factors that go into making a public health strategy successful or not that may affect whether these tests have an impact. So where am I? Well, we're still kind of here along this route. We're still working our way towards making sure that we have the right problem, formulating the policy alternatives, and making decisions. And I'll just leave you with a couple of things. You know, as a result of doing a lot of, well, not just me, but at WHO, doing a lot of thinking about this, we really want to get away from the term asymptomatic. First of all, most people are really meaning just no fever. They don't look at other symptoms that are present. And it tends to imply that these infections have no clinical consequences, but we don't know that that's true. We do know that chronic malaria can lead to anemia, so it's quite possible these very low density infections really are causing illness in an individual. You also don't know that just because I'm afebrile today doesn't mean I might not become febrile tomorrow. And we therefore sort of recommend that we be more specific and talk about either afebrile or minimally symptomatic. Also, we try to move away from the idea of submicroscopic and subpatent because they imply sort of the comparison of two diagnostic methods, and sometimes you don't know whether an infection would have been detected by microscopy when you've detected it by PCR. So we prefer to use the term low density. And then I don't know what to say about reservoir. I don't really have an alternative, but it is sort of a very static term when we can see that all of these infections are incredibly dynamic. So maybe we need like a stream idea instead of a reservoir. And then I'll just leave off with this challenge to interrupting malaria transmission. I think this is great because, yeah, really easy. I mean, first of all, the United States didn't go on to be certified until around 1970, so around 60 years after it was supposed to be so easy. But reading further, this really caught my eye. I think Justin said, you know, we're doomed to repeat history. And of course, everything old is new again. But back in the 1900s, we already knew that people had when they carried the parasites in their blood for months afterwards, even after treatment. So this is not a new idea at all. And then I took a page out of Sharon's presentation and quickly threw up WHO internships, which are available. They're unfunded, and Geneva is an expensive place. But if anyone's interested, I'd love to talk to people who might want to come for summer and help us out at WHO. I actually am a CDC employee, seconded to WHO, so I'm also going to plug CDC. We've got a number of fellowships for people who have recently graduated, and then fellowships for medical students and other kinds of internships as well. So I encourage you all to look them up because it's a great opportunity. And then I'd just like to say another thank you to Mark. It's been a real pleasure. I know we'll continue to meet at every TropMed from now until whenever. And so thank you again for launching me on this career. No, they're not present. So certainly we have no tests right now that can detect the liver stage, the hypnozoites. It's a huge problem. And gametocytes also are not picked up by those rapid diagnostic tests, so it's just the asexual stage in the blood. But I didn't mention, but most of the work that's been done that's compared gametocyte densities to, well, first of all, gametocytes appear after, for P. falciparum, they appear after The asexual parasites are in the blood. And all of the data would suggest that they're very correlated, the densities of gametocytes and the densities of asexual. And so most people recommend, WHO recommends, we don't need gametocyte-specific density measurements, that you can use asexual measurements as a proxy.
Is the number of clones in circulation in high transmission areas and low transmission areas really different?
Very different, yeah. So the multiplicity of infection is much higher in high transmission areas. So people are getting exposed to lots of different genes on the malaria parasite in the high transmission area. And then as transmission declines, there's usually one strain that sort of outcompetes or ends up becoming predominant in an area. And at the very last stages, when there are very few infections, they're almost all clonal at that point.
You sort of implied that a highly sensitive test, something like the PCR, the major use would be in the test and treat kind of context. I think the greatest usefulness of highly sensitive assays, and I think that, by the way, modern technology can get something a lot cheaper than a PCR. There are a lot of different approaches. PCR are almost by definition is an expensive test. The greatest use would be to understand the dynamics of the system. Its greatest help in making decisions about control and eradication would be to inform the models from the three major groups that are doing the malaria modeling now. To what areas they need to expand their models. What simplifying assumptions in their models are not being held at this time. That would make those models so much more useful for making public health decisions for interventions. So to me, the one great technology that's emerging is the ability to make synthetic antigens at very high level and explore their relationships and make very specific synthetic antigens for distinct purposes. And these then can be used in cross-sectional pseudo-surveys that can tell us a lot about the history of everybody. So when you do a survey, you're getting information not only on who's actively infected, which you can get, by the way, from the antibody test because of the effects on the ability of the antibodies. So that I think that thinking that this is the immediate response, test and treat is what you're going to use this for. I think you need to do this first stage first, where you really understand the dynamics of transmission. You've hinted at the idea that we could have this big reservoir of low-level transmission that's going to hold on, for a long time, and then going to be a source for explosive when our resources run out. As Justin says, but if we have better knowledge about the transmission dynamics of the whole system, we can make better decisions.
Well, PCR is being used from a research perspective to understand transmission dynamics better. It's been used for 20 years now for that purpose. So this cassette has come out. This RDT is being aimed at programs. And so I was speaking from more of a programmatic perspective. Is there any use within programs for this kind of rapid diagnostic test? And at the moment, we don't see one. We're still looking for more information to say under what kind of programmatic application might it have utility. There's still a lot of questions about malaria in pregnancy and whether very low density infections can still cause enough inflammation that there is harm to the fetus. And so maybe perhaps that might be an application. Mass test and treat from a programmatic point of view is still a potential. Finding the right spot along the transmission continuum to do that is still a good question. I don't think it's the very low transmission areas. I don't think that you're going to find enough of these silent infections. I think most of the infections at that low level are largely symptomatic. And then it's more about making sure that the health system is attracting people to come for treatment than it is about trying to go out and find a few parasites hidden here and there. And the serology, I think we're all desperately looking forward to good serologic techniques for malaria. And there's a lot of work being done in Haiti is one site, but those methods are not standardized. We don't have labs that can reproduce results from one lab to the next consistently. So it's a big area of work, and again, we're looking forward to that, but we don't have it yet.
Yeah, indeed, the technology to develop that has only been recently developed, but it's extremely promising.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of work being done with Luminex platforms throughout. In fact, there's a big study that CDC is conducting with PAHO throughout Latin America to try and look at multiplex Luminex platforms where you can run a whole bunch of parasitic diseases and malaria at one time and get information about exposure to a lot of pathogens. So yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting, and we look forward to it. But at WHO, we definitely think much more about like what's going on now in terms of what should programs be doing. And again, this new RDT that's come out, it's sort of like came out maybe too early. We're not really sure yet where to deploy it, and so we're still sort of trying to figure that area out.
Quick question. I may have missed it, but how much did you guys factor in the extra cost of the highly sensitive RDT over the standard RDT in this final policy decision?
Well, so no final policy decision's been made. So we're still waiting. What we've just basically done is put out use cases that we think where it might be useful, and gave some directions on what we think would be the appropriate study design to be able to make a policy decision about it. But there's not enough data at this point, we don't think, to be able to make a policy decision.
Will the added cost factor into the final policy?
I don't think cost will factor in. Cost is always a dynamic issue, and first of all, they haven't given us a particular cost right now, and it's going to depend on scale. But I think also it's going to be swamped by the potential cost of retraining and other issues. So I think people don't think that the cassette itself is really the cost issue. It's everything that has to go around reorienting programs to its use, and potential knock-on effects like more ACTs being required because more people get treated. And again, even the manufacturers never expected it to be deployed in high burden settings. So they were always targeting the southern province of Zambia or parts of Madagascar and Ethiopia, but not Nigeria.
Excellent presentation, Dr. Thank you, Kim. But I have a question for Kim and Justin and for Sharon, who unfortunately isn't here, so she can't answer. But for the two of you, the three of you have graduated from the University of Michigan, research-intensive institution where you learn to do outstanding research, which you've shown us today, and yet you're not working at research-intensive institutions in the traditional sense. You're working for government agencies, for an NGO, and many of our graduates don't think of those institutions as places where they can pursue scholarly research. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that and might help all of us to think through how opportunities arise in these settings despite what we tend to think.
Oh, I feel like I've just been dissed. I don't know what to say to that. I mean, CDC offered, I feel like I spent most of my career until very recently doing field-based research or field-based surveillance, probably, both community and facility-based surveillance. So it's not always interventional. Sometimes it's descriptive. But it felt like research. There was still a lot of study design and a lot of analytical design. I still do SAS every week, and that I learned here. Although I wish I'd learned R, but that wasn't available at the time. So I still do. I up until recently, I was still doing that stuff all the time, and so it felt like I was doing research, and yet for me, I needed to see a more immediate application of it. So the idea that was working with ministries of health and helping them to understand the situation that was going on and lead to better health outcomes on a much shorter time scale was important to me to have that direct link. But I also don't think I was scholarly enough to go into an academy anywhere. I don't know, Justin.
Yeah, no, I always thought of Kim as doing high quality research. I got excited when her papers came out because I knew they were going to be both high quality and useful in terms of answering questions of immediate importance to programs.
So nice.
And I think there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum between folks who work on research sites that have been established for the last 25 years and are producing these longitudinal data sets and that feed publications that feed sort of this more slightly less directly tied to decision-making kind of information, but that contribute to the knowledge that we might have about a disease like malaria. And that's useful. We need those data sets in order to understand some of the longer-term dynamics of the immunology and how it changes over time as transmission wanes and things like that. But I think there's also a need for operational research, the need for thinking about shorter-term questions that programs are trying to answer. And those are both valid types of research. You can publish papers on both types of research, but they're quite different. And they're done on different timescales. They're often done with different degrees of intensity from a research perspective. I've done research on can you get rapid diagnostic tests to be used in the private sector of high-endemic countries like Nigeria. And we want to test that out and see, do people do these appropriately? Do they produce useful information? Is this something that could be scaled, right? And so we can publish a paper on that, we can contribute to knowledge, and we can figure out something that the program is asking us to do so that they can quickly make a decision and move forward. And from where I sit, I hope that's not perceived as a lesser type of contribution to knowledge. I think it's just a different contribution to knowledge.
I'll take Mark's question a step further down. I think what he's really asking is, how do we convince our students that this is something interesting and exciting and worth doing? Now, not just the research-intensive graduate students, but the undergraduates who think they want to be poets because there's nothing interesting except sitting in a laboratory with test tubes for moving small amounts of liquid from one thing to another. That there is something else going. And take it even further down to the middle school kids who, until maybe the Flint water issue or the Zika thing, never thought that there was anything in public health except go get your vaccinations and if somebody gets syphilis, they've got to be treated. Of course, it's sort of boring. You're only dealing with sick people, and it doesn't do anything. But how do we get that information as this kind of excitement down to every level, graduate students, undergraduate students, and the general public?
Well, I guess I'm kind of surprised you're asking that then, because it seems to me like there's been a huge upswell in interest in global health since I started. I mean, I remember when I was here, we had, most people didn't know what epidemiology was. I remember when I was here, okay, I'll admit it was 1990, and there was some television program on, and we were reading it was something called the TV Guide, and it said something about like epidemiologist Karen Slater tackles an outbreak of the plague in New York City, and we're like, an epidemiologist on TV, and we all watched it because it was such a new thing. And now, I mean, people seem to know what epidemiologists are, and Zika and Ebola and all of those have really, I think, increased a lot the interest. But if you don't think it's there, then I guess I'm only talking to my peers. Sorry?
Since AIDS has been cured, there's not
I didn't hear that.
Neither did I. AIDS has been cured. Most of my students have.
Really? Oh.
It's not an issue.
Well, and then I think that we do need to do more outreach. There's a maybe this is something Michigan can replicate. CDC has a disease detective camp in the summer where they bring in high school students and they do outbreak investigations, and it's awesome. That would be, I'm sure that you get a lot of students who would love to bring in, high school or middle school students to do things like that. I've gone to schools in the past and done little mini outbreak investigations where, you give them plates of food and you've like tagged the back and it's a huge amount of fun. So we do have to do more things like that and build the base.
I think exposure is very important. I mean, I know when I was an undergraduate, I did not know what epidemiology was. I think I literally applied for this program not really knowing what epidemiology was. When I got my schedule and it was like, your first 3 courses are statistics, biostatistics, and advanced methods of statistics, I said, what the hell is that? I thought it was more like we'd go to Africa and look for Ebola kind of stuff. But I didn't know. And I was at Yale, which is a good school and a snooty school where if you're interested in medical things, you go to medical school. And when I went to career services and I said, I'm interested in epidemiology, they said, you're the second person who's ever come here and said that. So that's where we were. And I like to think it's gotten better since then. I think you have an undergraduate program in public health now, which
Yeah, it's amazing.
But then when you're here, I do think, I hope this day has been useful. I've had several students come and say, we're very interested in NGOs. We're interested in the sort of things we've been hearing about here. Sharon interned at the West Virginia Health Department when she was here, or right before she came here. But she did that because she knew already. She came in with some of that knowledge, and I'm hopeful that by this sort of event, you do expose students to a wider range of potential career paths, and you help to show what's out there. And some people will want to stay in academia and do more researchy things, and some people want to do more programmatic things, and hopefully at least folks will know what's out there.
I guess my main question was aiming towards encouraging those who aren't sure about whether or not going into epidemiology and wanting to do research still will allow them to go into an NGO or go into a government agency, because opportunities do exist to continue to do research and develop insights and apply.
And the best thing is you don't have to raise money if you're in government. Well, you do it to a certain extent, but you have a lot. Depending where you go, you already have enough funds to do things. It's very nice.
You weren't trying to put us down.
This thing about the academic versus the practical setting, what's the more valuable? I think what happens, what needs to be changed now is us as academics and other kind of researchers need to have a broader audience, need to have a broader network, down to the level of the people who need care. I really like Jenna's question, about what about all the other fields? Isn't that the population that we need to relate to, that they're seeing these other kind of things? And when we bring all that in, then we do a different kind of research. And that research is not necessarily going to be done by academics in universities. It's going to be done by people who are practical in the field.
So Mark, do you want to give some closing words?
No, but I guess well, no, I really have nothing prepared, so this is tough. I just want to thank the three of you, first of all, for taking the time, and it was a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come and present your thoughts to us, and everyone else who sat with us all to listen to those thoughts. My sense is that it's, okay, so this is supposed to be in my honor, but frankly, I don't think that's really what it's all about. I think what it's all about is having people who care about the health of the people, the public, who want to do good research, but need to learn in order to do that, how to do good research, how to do good intervention, and they come to a program like this. And the mentors that you see, these are part of the mentors now, and I've been a mentor. We're only a small part of the whole thing. Really, the major focus and the applause ought to be for those of you who are willing to move forward and give of yourselves what you've learned. Take from us as much as you can. And I think that's the key here. We have an outstanding group of students who come to our programs every year. And that's the real wealth and riches that we have. I'll speak for myself, and I think all my faculty colleagues are really fortunate to have the opportunity to work with all of you. And I think that's the way that I like to view this exchange. We're all colleagues, we're all part of the same set of goals, and I've been fortunate enough to have a career that they agreed to pay me to do something I love, which is really lucky. So I'm here to thank you as much as